Those who chronicle the two-part competition through which Eisenman won the commission have said again and again that Eisenman's project was the most abstract of the 19 submissions. We want to ask now, why did the architect choose abstraction over some more realistic depiction of the abject suffering of the victims? We're told that abstract art is an art that doesn't allow us interpretation with reference to something in reality that's being depicted. Is the choice of abstraction then just a vague refusal to represent what should be, what could be represented realistically? Or is it more than that? While the Holocaust and abstraction have not often been put together in art history, there is a very powerful body of literature in philosophy and in theoretical writing that often sanctions and even recommends abstract art over realistic art. The thinking goes something like this. To represent the victim's suffering realistically gives us an image that fixes, that stabilizes the victim's condition rather than actually inviting us and requiring us an active, living memory. To wrest any kind of aesthetic pleasure out of a realistic depiction would just further victimize those who suffered. And then finally, to try to find some redemption, to try to find some relief, as if we could project our collective guilt onto these realistic images. To try to find some redemption would just falsify the actual horror itself. Abstract architecture tends to focus more on form and structure rather than content and subject matter. With this interpretation, we might begin to get at the hidden meanings, those things that are unsayable and unthinkable and perhaps even unrepresentable. This can be quite productive in a project like this. If we make the structure of denial part of the content of the work, we make denial itself part of the content of the work, then the architecture might be able to bear the device of denial itself. The abstract tends toward a high degree of autonomy, but we don't want to say that the abstract denies signification itself. What we have to do now is find other ways of explaining, let's say, the operations of abstraction and how abstraction produces different kinds of signification. The first of these, and maybe in some ways the most important in this project, is repetition. It's very important that the way these blocks are repeated. The repetition takes our focus away from the attention on the object. It's not like looking at the facade of a church, or it's not like studying a single piece of sculpture. The representation takes the attention away from the object and puts it on the process of repetition itself, the process of reproduction. There's also a kind of randomness that results from this process of repetition. The way the blocks seem to come up out of the earth, even though there is a limit to the site, it's almost implied that the blocks continue under the earth almost to infinity, as if just this particular site has revealed the blocks that otherwise might be spread to infinity. So repetition also gives a kind of randomness and an limitlessness to the project. Repetition takes away any center or any central moment of focus. It distributes space sort of evenly and horizontally. There's no clear route. There's no directed place to go. And yet the field of blocks doesn't seem homogeneous. It rather, because of the randomness, because of the tilts, because of the difference in heights, you actually feel like what's been created is a field of difference, a field that's charged with difference. Even though this project is a memorial, it's not monumental. Indeed, it's this kind of undoing of monumentality. For a monument, we expect it to be stable. We expect it to be intense. We expect it to have a center and a focus. But in this project, there is no center. There's no clear direction. There's no spot. There's no marked site. In comparison, think of a monument like the Washington Monument, which marks a definite spot, which gives a kind of specificity of place, which gives a fixity to the experience. The memorial to the murdered Jews gives you no direction. It gives you no center. It gives you no focus. It doesn't tell you where to go. It doesn't tell you how to stabilize or fix the image. So the first operation of abstraction is repetition. The second aspect of abstraction involves us with a different dimension of the project, and that is the fact that it has a temporal dimension. The memorial has to be experienced in time. The architecture has to be performed. When you come upon the site, you're almost in the project before you know it. The blocks start off very low, but very, very quickly the ground moves down, the blocks move up, and the outside world is shut out. Once you're in the project and lose the horizon and lose the surroundings, the project actually becomes very enclosing. And then you're required to sort of focus on things that are immediate, that are right there in experience, right there in the present. You focus on the textures, the kind of inert coolness of the blocks. You focus on the way the light is constantly changing, the way there are bright spots and shadows. You focus on the ground, on the crunch of the gravel and the kind of undulation of the ground. And your whole experience becomes not a kind of constructed image of past history, but it becomes an intensified experience of the present, of this moment. You remember just a moment ago, you project forward just to a moment from now, but mainly you're in the present. And I think this is the way, we might call this a sort of peripatetic architecture, an architecture that you have to walk through, an architecture that you experience really as much with your body as you do your mind. And this peripatetic architecture is the way that Eisenman doesn't give us a fixed history of the Holocaust, in the same way he doesn't give us an image of the Holocaust, but he gives us a way of remembering, a living memory, or perhaps maybe it's just a way not to forget, to keep the mental flows, the energies, the thoughts active. The third aspect of abstraction has to do with the treatment of the ground in the memorial. There's something very important about the ground for the human body. The ground, a stable ground, gives us a kind of bodily security as well as mental sort of certainty. When the ground is disturbed, that certainty is taken away. Think about the experience of an earthquake. There's nothing more disturbing, more horrifying than the sense that the very ground underneath you has become arbitrary, has become uncertain. There's a particular characteristic in Germany of the ground that has to do with the Nazis' tendency to make a fetish out of the earth itself, out of the German soil. And these two things together are important because the operation that the memorial performs on the ground is a disturbance. And the fact that this German soil in the center of Berlin has been disturbed, has been made arbitrary. The ground, though it seems to give you that kind of bodily security, it quickly gives way. The undulations are a little too strong. The architects also placed very coarse gravel on the ground that focuses your attention, both acoustically as well as visually, on the surface of the ground, on this kind of crunch. And it's the crunch, the sliding, the undulations that disturbs the sense of ground, that disturbs the sense of security. And that's a very important part of the way the abstraction, again, works in a bodily way as well as a conceptual way. It is something that's, even though the experience is an individual bodily experience, there's a kind of collectivity, there's a kind of ideological collective that is also being disturbed and manipulated in that operation on the ground. The aspects of abstraction that we've talked about so far have been primarily phenomenological, and I mean that they're primarily derived from an experience of the body, of the individual body moving through space. The fourth dimension of abstraction moves from the phenomenal or the experiential toward the structural. This is in some ways perhaps the most abstract of these operations of abstraction. That is the grid itself. It's very important that this project is fundamentally simply the superimposition of an abstract grid on the specific concrete site in Berlin. It is this superimposition that marks the site as a site. Let's think about the grid. The grid is anti-natural, it's systematic, it is highly constructed, it's highly artificial, it's calibrated. In some way, the grid is the kind of lowest common denominator of architecture itself, architecture in all its in all its geometrical qualities, in its calibration, in its measured qualities. The grid is just the sign of architecture itself. The grid doesn't represent, it relates. If you have a grid, anything you put in a grid relates to everything else on the grid. So it's extremely relational, even though it's non-representational. But the grid in Eisenman's project is even more complex because there are actually two grids. We talked a little bit about the tilt in the blocks and the different height of the blocks. The project was conceptualized as, in Eisenman's words, as the product of two topographies. There's one topography, which is the ground itself, the undulating ground itself. But there's another topography, which you can kind of see from the aerial photographs of the project, that is a topography that seems to be laid over the top of the project. And the way the project was conceptualized was that there were these two grids, equal but shifted relative to one another. And then the grids were kind of thrown into a kind of topographical undulation. And each grid, the grid on the ground and the grid above, each is undulating at different rates. And they're also not lining up. They're slightly misaligned. And then the blocks are nothing other than the connection of the points of those two grids. So that's what gives the blocks its tilt, and that's what gives the blocks this random height. This is really interesting, the effect of that. It's an absolutely systematic procedure. It's not subjective. It's not authored. It's not like the creation of some. You don't sense that someone has created this grid. It seems to be totally constructed, artificial and systematic, and yet it produces the effect of randomness. And I think it's this interaction of systematicity and randomness that really focuses the abstraction of this project. Now, notice that you can't actually perceive these two grids. You can't actually see the two grids at the same time. You can't photograph the two grids together. The understanding of the operations of the grids, and this operation of abstraction, must take place in the architectural imagination. As we walk through it, we start to construct in our minds the interaction of these two grids. So let's think about what we've done so far in our operations of abstraction. We've moved from an attention on the object to a field. We've moved from a single object as a focus to the process of repetition as a focus, and the process by which these two undulating grids create these objects. And we've moved from phenomenon and experience to structure and the imagination, to the idea that the concept of this project and the organization of this project can only take place, can only be known in the architectural imagination as a kind of summing up and a gathering together of the spatial information that we receive in our experience of the building. Now we'll look at the fifth and final dimension of abstraction. But first, let's start in a slightly different way and start with some associations. I want to think about two sites that perhaps Eisenman is attempting to evoke or refer to in his project. Think about the old Jewish cemetery in Prague. This is a very old cemetery on a relatively small site, and it's existed for centuries. According to Jewish law, you cannot disinter a body. So when the Prague cemetery was filled, and when there was no more room, rather than disinter the bodies, they simply piled more earth on top of the bodies so they could bury more. And this was done like 7 or 8 times until this large mound formed. Now, also according to Jewish law, there cannot be a grave without a headstone. So the old headstones of the first few layers, when the additional layers of earth were piled on top, the old headstones had to be brought up. And the effect of this is a kind of, is 2 things. One, the headstones are showing wear. They're also tilting because of age. They're tilting because they've been moved. And I think there's some association with these headstones and their tilt and their crowdedness and their kind of randomness that we have an association perhaps with the memorial in Berlin. But there's a very, very important difference. Again, according to Jewish law, the headstones have to have a name. The person buried there has to be named. One of the most striking things about the memorial in Berlin is that there are no names. In Prague, because of the age of the headstones, because of the movement and replacement of the headstones, slowly over time, the names have been erased. The inscriptions have been muted. By contrast, in Berlin, the names have been refused. Look at a second cemetery. This is the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, and this is the site of the second coming of the Messiah. And again, because the crypts are above ground, because of the way they're organized in the grid, again, I think there's some association, some possible association to the memorial in Berlin. But it's important that in the memorial in Berlin, there are no bodies. The Mount of Olives, the actual bodies are there. And again, the bodies are named. One of the most striking things about Berlin is the refusal of names. It's almost like because of these other precedents, because of these other associations, we expect to find names. And the fact that the names have been refused, it's almost like the names have been erased. It's that negation of the names which comes as a kind of shock, as a kind of negative force. Now, there are reasons for this refusal to name. First of all, in the case of the Holocaust, we don't know all the victims. We couldn't, even if Eisenman had wanted to, we couldn't name all the victims. The records aren't complete. Many of the victims were unknown. But more important, the absence of inscription signifies a requirement for critical memory. Think of it this way. If we had an archive, if we had all the names and we represented the Holocaust through this archive, that would fix the history of the Holocaust. It would make it certain, it would make it in some way over and done with, and in that way forgettable. But the Holocaust exceeds its archive. The Holocaust and the living memory of the Holocaust must exceed the archive. So in refusing inscription, in refusing to try to represent the archive, Eisenman has forced us to continue to remember, to refuse to forget.